Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today, we are diving into the ultimate human dilemma. Where does evil come from? We'll explore whether we are caught in a cosmic supernatural battle between God and Satan, or if evil is just a biological glitch in the brain that science and secularism can completely explain. We will trace the historical invention of the devil, look at the brain scans of psychopaths, and ask a fundamental question about atheism and belief. Do we really need a supernatural God watching us to keep us from doing bad things? If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button.
It's quite a lineup we have today. I mean, wrestling with the origins of human morality is basically the oldest human pastime, right?
Right. And seriously, I'm so glad you shared this specific stack of sources with us for today's deep dive. You've handed us this incredible, this really wild mix of deep theology, historical anthropology, and cutting-edge neuroscience.
Yeah, it's a massive landscape. But what I find most compelling for you listening right now is that despite the thousands of years separating these different sources, they're all essentially trying to solve the exact same mystery.
Yeah, the classic why do bad things happen question. Or more specifically, when someone does something horrific, why did they do it?
Exactly. And more importantly, how do we stop it? Are we dealing with a broken soul or just a broken machine?
Let's start right there, actually,
Yeah.
at the most extreme, undeniable manifestation of evil in humans. So think about someone who commits a truly heinous act, a serial killer.
Right, the worst of the worst.
Exactly. When we look at that person, are they suffering from a spiritual failing, like some dark, malevolent force in their spirit? Or is it simply a mechanical failure of the physical body?
To really grapple with that, we have to look closely at the work of neuroscientist Dr. Kent Keel. His study is detailed in the sources you provided, and he actually put this exact question to the test.
Oh, the prison study. This part was wild.
It really is. So, he took a mobile MRI scanner into a maximum security prison. He actually sat down with an inmate who had committed unspeakable crimes, multiple murders, assaults, things most of us can't even stomach thinking about.
Right.
And when Dr. Keel asked him why you did it, the inmate's answer was just chillingly clinical. He essentially said he had an impulse and he simply lacked the physical ability to stop himself.
And he felt absolutely zero remorse. None at all.
Yeah, literally zero.
The guy explicitly told the researchers that he just isn't wired the same as everybody else. It's almost like he viewed himself as a totally different species.
And the terrifying thing is, Dr. Keel's MRI scans proved the inmate was absolutely right.
Wait, really? The scan literally showed the difference.
Oh, definitively. Keel quantified the different areas of this man's brain and found that he was in the 99th percentile for psychopathy. But the real smoking gun was in a specific region called the orbital frontal cortex.
Okay, so what does that part of the brain actually do?
Mechanically speaking, it's the area responsible for impulse control. It regulates behavior and calculates long-term consequences. So, in a typical brain, if you get furious and want to lash out, your orbital frontal cortex instantly flashes an image of you going to jail.
Oh, I see. It essentially hits the brakes.
Exactly. But in this particular inmate, that area was severely underdeveloped. It was physically atrophied. The brake pedal simply wasn't there.
Wow. And this is where the implications get incredibly heavy, especially when we start evaluating the secular worldview versus a religious one, because this is the ultimate scientific explanation for evil.
It really is. It's not a demonic force possessing someone. It's just bad neural wiring.
But I really struggle with the moral fallout of that. Think about a car where the brake lines have been completely severed. If that car rolls down a steep hill and crashes into a crowd of pedestrians, you don't call the car evil.
Right. You just say it lacked brakes.
Exactly. So if a human being is physically missing the neural brakes in their orbital frontal cortex, can we even use the word evil in a moral sense? Doesn't this biological view completely eliminate the theological need for a God to save us?
That is the pivotal challenge neuroscience poses to theology, for sure. If extreme bad behavior is purely biological, then it's not a sin, it's a sickness. And if it's a sickness, we don't need a priest or a savior, we need a neurologist.
Right. But I'm guessing the theological sources don't just concede that point, do they?
Definitely not. The sources don't let humanity off the hook quite that easily. Because while the brain scan explains the extreme 1 in a million psychopath, it doesn't explain the rest of us.
Ah, right. It doesn't explain the everyday cruelty, the lying, the selfishness that perfectly neurotypical people inflict on each other every single day.
Precisely. And that's where we have to look at the theological perspective provided in the materials by Baptist Reverend and theologian Kutakala.
Oh, the section on original sin.
Yes. But he looks at it not necessarily as some magical, ancient curse handed down from a literal garden. He frames it as inherent bend toward death, violence, and selfishness that exists universally across humanity.
So he's arguing that even if extreme psychopaths have a severe biological deficit, there is still a capacity for malice in everyone else. Like there was a little bit of that extreme psychopathic inmate in all of us.
Yeah, that's exactly his point. He even points out that Jesus, in the New Testament, recognized this dual nature in neurotypical people. He told his own devoted disciple, "Get behind me, Satan."
Wow. So the theological argument here is that even if you have a perfectly healthy, plump, orbital frontal cortex, you still possess the capacity to actively steer away from what is good. You still choose the dark sometimes.
Which forces us to look at how we conceptualize that dark side. If everyday people have always recognized this internal, universal capacity for bad deeds, how did we externalize it?
Yeah, how did humanity go from recognizing our own internal flaws to inventing a literal red pitchfork-wielding devil as the archenemy of God?
Well, the history on that is absolutely fascinating.
I think this detail will completely blow your mind if you're listening and you've never studied biblical history. The stereotypical image of Satan isn't actually in the Bible. All that stuff with the horns and the hooves.
Yeah, that's a mix of medieval folklore, Renaissance art, and Dante's Inferno.
Exactly. But even the core concept of Satan as God's ultimate evil enemy isn't in the earliest Hebrew texts. In early books like Job, the Satan was just a job title.
Right, the Hebrew word Satan simply translates to adversary or accuser. In the ancient Israelite worldview, God was entirely supreme, responsible for both the good and the bad in the world.
So what was the Satan's actual job then?
The Satan was just a divine prosecutor within God's own heavenly council. He wasn't the ruler of a fiery underworld trying to destroy creation. His job was basically to audit human faith on God's behalf.
He was a heavenly tax collector.
No.
Not a supervillain. So how do we get from a divine auditor to the literal prince of darkness?
To figure that out, we have to look at the specific historical and political circumstances of the ancient Israelites. We have to apply what historians call the 5 C's, specifically contingency and context.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So, in 586 BCE, Jerusalem is sacked by the Babylonians, the temple is destroyed, and the Judean elites are carried off into exile. They are traumatized, suffering, and questioning how their supreme God could allow this to happen to them.
Right, it creates a huge theological crisis.
Exactly. And eventually, the Babylonians are conquered by the Persian Empire, and the exiled Judeans come under Persian rule. Now, the Persians practiced a very ancient, highly influential religion called Zoroastrianism.
And Zoroastrianism introduces a radically different way to look at the universe, right? It is deeply dualistic.
Entirely dualistic. Zoroastrianism teaches that there isn't just one supreme being causing everything. Instead, there is a perfectly good divine being named Ahura Mazda, and he is locked in a constant cosmic battle with a wholly evil being named Angra Mainyu.
Pure light versus absolute dark. Perfect good versus absolute evil. I mean, this must have been a revelation for the exiled Judeans, because suddenly they had a framework to explain their suffering.
Yes, it wasn't that God was punishing them, it was that a rival evil force was attacking them. That cultural exchange fundamentally altered the trajectory of Western religion.
So through centuries of living alongside Persian culture, this Zoroastrian dualism merged with Jewish theology. And you can physically see the text change over time in the sources.
You really can. When you look at the later Second Temple Jewish texts in the materials, things like the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Book of First Enoch, suddenly the theology is unrecognizable from the early days of Job.
Yeah, suddenly you have these sprawling stories of a cosmic struggle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. You have rogue angels literally falling from the heavens to corrupt mankind.
And you have leaders of these dark forces suddenly being named, figures like Belial, Asael, or Shemihaza.
It's just wild how it evolves.
It is, and historians refer to this kind of evolution as contingency. It means historical outcomes depend on a highly specific string of prior conditions.
Meaning, if the Babylonians hadn't conquered Judah, and if the Persians hadn't subsequently conquered the Babylonians.
Exactly. Those Judean elites might never have spent generations immersed in Zoroastrian dualism. The entire concept of a cosmic war between God and Satan, a concept that is absolutely foundational to modern Christianity and Islam, wasn't dropped from the sky on day one.
It evolved because of very specific political and cultural blending thousands of years ago. That realization totally shifts your perspective.
It really does.
But it also creates a massive vacuum, I think. This is where we need to heavily evaluate the atheism and belief dynamics here. Because if the devil is largely a historical construct born from cultural blending, does that mean human morality falls apart without a literal supernatural force keeping score?
That is a big question, isn't it?
Yeah. If we don't have a literal God watching us, do we just revert to our selfish biology?
That is the core anxiety driving the debate between secularism and religion. Can we be good without God? And your sources offer a fascinating window into this through a psychological study conducted by Jesse Bering.
Oh, the dart throwing experiment. I love this one. It's brilliantly simple.
Tell him how it works.
Okay, picture this. You put a child in a room with a dartboard and a piece of tape on the floor. You tell the kid they have to throw the darts over their shoulder with their back to the board without stepping over the tape. It's almost impossible.
It's incredibly difficult. Yeah.
Right. But you tell them if they get a high score, they win a highly desirable prize. Then the researcher leaves the room, leaving the child completely alone. So what did the hidden cameras actually show?
They show the kids cheating, almost universally. The moment they believe they are unobserved, they step over the line, walk right up to the board, and physically place the darts into the bullseye by hand.
Which, from a purely biological evolutionary standpoint, is the logical, self-interested thing to do, right? They want the resource, the prize, and there's no risk of penalty, so they just take it.
Exactly. But then Jesse Bering runs the experiment again with a new group of kids. This time, before leaving the room, he points to a completely empty chair in the corner.
The famous Princess Alice.
Yes. He tells the child that a magical, invisible entity named Princess Alice is sitting in that chair, and she will be watching them while he's gone.
And the change in behavior is just staggering.
It really is. The kids, believing they are under the invisible gaze of Princess Alice, significantly stop cheating. They stay behind the line. Some of them even physically wave at the empty chair or walk over to poke it, trying to figure out if she's really there.
So just the mere suggestion of an invisible watcher completely overrides their biological impulse to cheat. Princess Alice is essentially functioning as a cosmic security camera.
That's a great way to put it. And this is where the secular critique of religion hits hardest. Evolutionary psychologists look at this and argue that the concept of an all-seeing God is essentially just human society's version of Princess Alice.
Right, because as human tribes grew larger, we couldn't physically police everyone anymore.
Exactly. So we invented a psychological tool, a God who sees everything, even in the dark, to enforce good social behavior when the actual authorities aren't around. It's the ultimate deterrent.
Jesse Bering notes that the proverbial question of morality is, would you rob a bank if you knew with absolute certainty you could get away with it?
And for a complex society to function, you need people to believe they can't ever get away with it. The threat of an all-knowing deity, the promise of a heavenly reward, the terror of eternal punishment, these concepts act as psychological guardrails.
And what's wild is that humanity has been using this exact psychological guardrail for millennia. This modern experiment with kids and darts perfectly mirrors the 3,500-year-old Egyptian tomb of Mena in Luxor that was highlighted in the sources.
Oh, the weighing of the heart scene. It is one of the most powerful visual representations of this concept in human history.
Absolutely. So inside this ancient tomb, painted vividly on the walls, is a depiction of the Egyptian afterlife. When a person dies, they are brought before the gods, and their physical heart is placed on a scale.
And on the other side of the scale
is the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and cosmic order. The belief was that every time you lied, stole, or committed an evil act in your life, your heart literally became heavier.
And if your heart is heavier than the feather, you fail the test. Your soul is devoured by a monster, and you are denied eternal life.
Exactly. The terror of having a heavy heart full of lies starving you from reaching the afterlife is just an ancient, monumentally higher stakes version of the Princess Alice experiment.
It assumes that the fear of profound consequences is the primary mechanism keeping us on the righteous path. But that forces us to confront a really difficult reality.
Which is?
If an atheist worldview removes the invisible watcher, if there is no Princess Alice, no God weighing your heart, what replaces the scale? If there is no supernatural judgment, how do different worldviews, both religious and secular, actually handle the real, tangible evil that happens in the world?
That's a great point, because whether you believe morality requires a security camera god, whether you believe it's threatened by a literal devil, or whether you think it's just dictated by brain chemistry, evil still happens.
Right. People still do terrible things to each other.
So how do we actually deal with it? Do we lean toward retribution or rehabilitation?
The sources provide a really striking contrast here between different global perspectives. In the Western Judeo-Christian tradition, there is a very stark dichotomy between good and evil. They are absolute opposites.
And we see this manifested in rituals like baptism, where a person is physically submerged in water to symbolically wash away their sins.
Exactly. Evil is viewed as a contaminant. It is something to be banished, washed off, defeated, and permanently separated from the good.
But then the sources take us to Varanasi, India, and we look at the Hindu approach, and it couldn't be more different. In this tradition, there isn't a strict, permanent wall between good and evil.
Right. In Varanasi, many believe that everyday evils, things like sudden sickness, financial ruin, or severe bad luck, are often caused by the unhappy souls of ancestors who suffered traumatic deaths.
But they don't view these spirits as demonic monsters that need to be exorcised or destroyed, right?
No, they view them as family members who are in pain and lashing out, which totally changes the prescription for how to fix the problem.
I love this analogy from the sources. The Western approach is like using a broad-spectrum antibiotic to completely nuke a bacteria, whereas the Hindu approach is more like using a vaccine. You introduce a little bit of the thing into the system to help it find equilibrium.
That's a perfect way to conceptualize it. In Varanasi, they don't try to banish the evil spirit, they feed it.
Literally. They perform rituals where they offer the invisible spirit honey, fruit, and clarified butter.
They even offer it an umbrella and a pair of shoes to help it on its journey. They treat the source of the evil caringly, respectfully, attempting to rehabilitate it and guide it into finding peace.
It's a profound shift. Evil isn't an external enemy to wage war against. It's a broken part of the community ecosystem that needs to be healed. And what's fascinating is how this ancient idea of internal healing actually mirrors modern secular thought.
Yes, specifically, we can see this by looking at how modern Zoroastrianism has evolved today.
Right. Because earlier we talked about how ancient Zoroastrianism gave the exiled Judeans the dualistic concept of a literal devil.
But modern Zoroastrianism has actually evolved away from that literalism, aligning surprisingly well with a secular, humanist worldview. They now view the devil entirely as an internal mentality. It is no longer a supernatural force prowling outside of us.
Their core motto today is good thoughts, good words, good deeds. Notice the progression. It starts in the mind and moves to action. It places the moral responsibility entirely on human beings.
The modern Zoroastrian perspective argues that all problems in the world are man-made and therefore they must be solved by man. As the source says, you don't get to blame your bad behavior on a supernatural force, and you can't rely on a god to magically fix the damage you've caused.
You have to purge the evil from within yourself every single day through your own deliberate actions. Which brings us to one of the most visceral, powerful stories in your source material, the story of Brian.
Oh man, Brian's story is intense.
It really is. So Brian was an ex-neo-Nazi. He was a skinhead enforcer for 16 years. By his own admission, he was the embodiment of evil. He wanted to cause utter destruction to anyone who wasn't like him.
He had no remorse, describing his former self as borderline sociopathic. He is the living, breathing manifestation of that inherent bend toward violence Reverend Kalla talked about.
But Brian wasn't a permanent lost cause. His story bridges the gap between our biological impulses, secular rehabilitation, and spiritual redemption.
Yeah, Brian experienced an epiphany, and it wasn't sparked by a supernatural vision. It was sparked by deeply human events. He met a woman, got married, and had a son.
And holding his child, he realized he simply couldn't bring new life into a world defined by the hatred he was perpetuating.
But just deciding to have good thoughts wasn't enough for Brian, because his physical body was a billboard for his past. His face and neck were completely covered in violent neo-Nazi tattoos.
He couldn't integrate into society or be a normal father looking like that. So to physically remove the markers of evil from his life, he underwent 2.5 years of agonizing laser tattoo removal.
He described the process as ungodly pain, like the smell of his own burning skin, his face constantly blistered and swollen.
And what elevates Brian's story is how he framed that suffering. He didn't just see it as a medical procedure. He viewed that intense, recurring physical pain as a penance.
Right. It was a tangible way to pay his dues for the immense pain he had caused others over those 16 years. And it was during that grueling, multi-year physical process that his internal world fully shifted.
He discovered a belief in a higher power. He realized that the capacity for immense good and terrible evil exists in all of us simultaneously, and he made the exhausting daily choice to actively leave the world better than he found it.
Brian is the ultimate proof of the human capacity for change. He wasn't permanently locked into his violent past by a cosmic demon, and he wasn't permanently broken by his biology.
Exactly. He actively chose good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, and he paid the physical price to make it a reality. Which really brings us to the core synthesis of everything we've looked at today across all these different fields.
Yeah, let's take a moment to summarize the massive amount of ground we've covered on this deep dive.
So we started in the realm of hard science, looking at the physical, biological reality of evil through the underdeveloped orbital frontal cortexes of psychopaths.
Then we traveled back in time to the Babylonian exile to see how Persian dualism gave birth to the concept of Satan as an external enemy.
We explored the atheism and belief debate, seeing how invisible washers from Princess Alice to the Egyptian goddess of truth act as psychological guardrails to keep us honest.
And finally, we saw how different cultures either fight, feed, or internally rehabilitate the darkness within them. And the unifying thread across all of this, the neuroscience, the history, the theology, is a deeply uncomfortable but strangely beautiful paradox.
The idea that without the existence of evil, without the profound human capacity to do wrong, humanity would never have developed our most beautiful characteristics.
Exactly. Without cruelty, the concept of mercy wouldn't even exist. Without sin and betrayal, we would have no need for forgiveness. Without the dark, the light has absolutely no meaning or value.
Our daily struggle against evil, whether you view that struggle as a biological imperative, a societal construct, or a spiritual war, is exactly what makes us capable of profound transcendent kindness.
It's what makes us human.
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to chew on after listening to all this. We started today by looking at Dr. Keel's MRI scans, seeing the physical atrophy in the impulse control centers of violent individuals.
Right, the missing brake pedals in the brain.
Yeah. And Dr. Keel has talked about the ultimate goal of developing treatments to remediate that atrophy in children long before they ever commit a crime. So I want you to imagine a future where neuroscience advances to the point where we can predict and medically cure an underdeveloped orbital frontal cortex in young children.
Oh, wow. That's a heavy thought.
If we can completely biologically erase a human being's physical capacity to commit extreme evil, would we also be erasing their capacity to actively choose profound moral goodness? If humanity is eventually biologically forced to be good, like a train locked onto a track, does our goodness actually mean anything anymore?
That really is the ultimate question of human existence.
Something for you to ponder as you go about your day. Thanks for diving deep with us today.